Meet Rachel Evans, a successful black woman in the tech industry who's finally earned a first-class seat, only to have her right to be there questioned. What starts as a simple flight becomes a turning point in her life, pushing her to stand her ground in ways that transform not only her career, but the entire industry. How does Rachel go from being underestimated to leading a movement for change? Watch to discover her inspiring journey of resilience, empowerment, and breaking barriers. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this, and share your thoughts in the comments if you've ever had to fight for your place. Rachel Evans stepped into the terminal at John F. Kennedy International Airport, her heart swelling with a blend of pride and anticipation. The air was alive with the sounds of rolling suitcases, flight announcements, and the soft hum of travelers moving through the bustling terminal. For most people, this was just another day of travel, another business trip or vacation. But for Rachel, this was more than that. She clutched her sleek leather suitcase with one hand, her other arm steadying the weight of her work satchel, which bore the embossed logo of Nexus Global Technologies. She'd carried that bag through countless business meetings, presentations, and corporate events. It had been with her on days when she was at her best, and on days when she had questioned whether she could keep going. Today, though, it felt lighter. Today was a celebration. As she walked through the crowd, her stride confident and purposeful, Rachel reflected on how far she had come. 42 years old, a senior sales director at a multinational tech company, and for the first time in her life, she was flying first class. This trip was her reward for being named Nexus Global's top sales manager of the year. An all-expenses-paid vacation to Paris, a city she had only dreamed of visiting. It wasn't just about the trip, though. This was a tangible symbol of the years of hard work, sleepless nights, and endless hustle. But even as she moved through the terminal with her head held high, Rachel could feel the familiar pangs of uncertainty creeping in. She had fought for every inch of success, every promotion, every bit of recognition. As a black woman in a white, male-dominated industry, she was used to being doubted. She had learned to expect it. The raised eyebrows, the unspoken questions, the subtle ways people tried to make her feel like she didn't belong. She had seen it happen to other women like her, and she had certainly experienced it enough herself. It didn't matter how many awards she'd won, how many deals she'd closed, or how many times she'd proven her worth. There were always those moments when she could feel it, the quiet, lingering doubt from others that she was out of place. But today was different. Today, she was determined to celebrate her success, no matter what. Rachel approached the check-in counter for her first-class flight with a smile. The airline agent, a woman with neatly styled hair and a crisp uniform, glanced up from her screen, her expression neutral at first. Rachel handed her ticket over, still smiling, ready for the smooth check-in process she had anticipated. The agent's brow furrowed slightly as she scanned the ticket, her eyes flicking up to meet Rachel's. There was a hesitation, a small pause, and then the agent's lips tightened. Are you sure this is the right ticket?" the agent asked, her tone polite but carrying an undercurrent of doubt. "This is for first class." Rachel's smile faltered, but she held it in place. She knew this dance all too well. The unspoken implication in the woman's words hung heavy between them. "Are you sure you belong here?" It wasn't an outright accusation, but it didn't need to be. Rachel had learned to read between the lines long ago. "Yes, I'm sure," Rachel replied, keeping her voice steady and polite. "This trip was awarded to me by my company, Nexus Global Technologies, for being the top sales manager of the year." She saw the agent blink, her fingers nervously tapping the keyboard as she processed Rachel's words. It wasn't the first time someone had questioned her credentials, and Rachel had become adept at navigating these encounters with calm, poised professionalism. Still, every time it happened, it left a small bruise on her confidence, a reminder that she was always going to have to prove herself just a little bit more than others. "I see," the agent finally said, though her voice lacked any real sincerity. She glanced at Rachel again, then made a show of rescanning the ticket, as if expecting the computer to reveal a mistake. Rachel's stomach tightened. The old, familiar frustration bubbled beneath the surface, but she kept it in check. This was supposed to be a celebration of her achievements, a moment to reflect on all the hard work she'd put in to get here. Yet here she was again, defending her right to occupy the space she had more than earned. The machine beeped, confirming her first-class seat. The agent printed Rachel's boarding pass, this time with an obligatory smile, though it was devoid of warmth. "Enjoy your flight," the agent said, handing the pass to Rachel with mechanical politeness. "Thank you," Rachel replied, her voice still steady, though inside she felt a small pang of disappointment. She took the boarding pass and moved away from the counter. Her confidence rattled just a little. As she walked through security and toward the gate, Rachel tried to push the encounter out of her mind. This wasn't the first time she'd faced this kind of subtle discrimination, and it wouldn't be the last. She had learned to weather it, to push through and rise above the doubts and assumptions. But no matter how many times it happened, it still left its mark. By the time she reached the gate, Rachel had convinced herself to let it go. She was determined not to let a minor inconvenience ruin what was supposed to be a joyous occasion. But as she handed her boarding pass to the gate agent, the same hesitation greeted her again. The man, who looked to be in his late 30s, glanced at her pass, then at her, his brows knitting together in subtle confusion. He hesitated, his fingers hovering over the scanner. Rachel could feel it, the same unspoken question, the same skepticism. He scanned the pass but didn't waver through immediately. Instead, he looked back at his screen, then back at Rachel, as though trying to reconcile what he was seeing. "Just one moment," he said, his voice neutral, but the hesitation in his eyes was unmistakable. "I need to check something in the system." Rachel sighed inwardly. Here we go again. As the seconds stretched on, she stood there, forcing herself to keep her expression neutral. But inside, frustration was mounting. She could feel the eyes of other passengers on her, the curious glances as they wondered what was taking so long. The same subtle message seemed to hang in the air around her. Do you really belong here? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the gate agent nodded and motioned for her to proceed. "You're all set," he said, his tone more businesslike now. "Enjoy your flight." Rachel thanked him and walked down the jet bridge, her back straight and her head high. She wouldn't let this get to her. Not today. Not after everything she had worked for. She had earned this trip. She had earned her place in first class. As she stepped onto the plane, the soft lighting and luxurious atmosphere of the first-class cabin welcomed her. The seats were spacious, upholstered in soft leather, each one with a plush pillow and blanket neatly arranged. A flight attendant greeted her with a smile, directing her to her seat, 2D by the window. Rachel stowed her carry-on in the overhead compartment and sank into her seat with a deep exhale. This was her moment. This was supposed to be a time to reflect on her success and relax, to enjoy the rewards of her hard work. But as she fastened her seatbelt and settled in, she couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had begun to gnaw at her. She glanced around the cabin, noticing the other passengers. Most of them seemed absorbed in their own pre-flight routines, checking their phones, flipping through in-flight magazines, or adjusting their seats. But here and there, she caught the furtive glances. Subtle at first, but unmistakable. They were watching her. An older couple seated diagonally across from her exchanged whispered words, their eyes lingering on her just a little too long. A middle-aged man in a tailored suit sitting in the row ahead glanced over his shoulder, his gaze flicking quickly between her and his seat, as though confirming what he was seeing. Rachel felt the weight of their eyes. It wasn't just curiosity. It was the same quiet judgment she had felt at the check-in counter in the gate. The same unspoken question, "What are you doing here?" She tried to ignore it, focusing on the in-flight menu in front of her. But the tension in the cabin seemed to grow with each passing minute. She could feel the stares, the whispered conversations, and it made her skin prickle with discomfort. Just as she was beginning to settle in, a flight attendant approached her. The woman's smile was wide, but there was something rehearsed about it. Polite, but not quite genuine. "Ma'am, hooray," the flight attendant said, her voice pleasant but firm. "Could I see your boarding pass again, please?" Rachel's heart sank. She knew what was coming. Rachel's heart quickened as the flight attendant stood beside her seat, asking to see her boarding pass once more. Her stomach clenched, a familiar knot of frustration forming inside her. She had known from the moment she stepped onto the plane that it would come to this. She had felt it in the way people had looked at her, in the questioning stares, the subtle doubt hanging in the air. But still, part of her had hoped she was wrong, that maybe this time her success wouldn't be met with skepticism. Without a word, Rachel handed over her boarding pass, her fingers steady even as her heart raced. The flight attendant, a woman in her mid-30s with perfectly styled hair and a too-wide smile, took the pass and glanced at it. Her eyes narrowed, and she looked back up at Rachel with that same carefully controlled expression of polite doubt. "We've been having some issues with seating arrangements," the flight attendant said, her tone syrupy sweet but still carrying that edge of authority. "It seems there might have been a mix-up with your seat. It's possible this wasn't meant to be available, and we might need to move you to an open seat in economy to avoid any confusion." Rachel's chest tightened, her breath catching slightly at the audacity of the suggestion. She had heard it before, of course. She had faced these kinds of comments in various forms throughout her life, in meeting rooms, at corporate events, and now here, on a first-class flight. It didn't matter that she had earned her place here, that her company had rewarded her for her achievements. All that seemed to matter, in the eyes of the flight attendant and the other passengers, was that she didn't fit the image of someone who belonged in this seat. The weight of the moment settled heavily on her shoulders, the familiar frustration rising inside her like a slow-building storm. But Rachel wasn't the type to lash out, no matter how much she wanted to. She had spent years perfecting her calm, measured responses, learning to navigate these situations without letting the anger show. Still, her voice was firm as she replied, "There's no mix-up. This seat was reserved for me by my company. I was awarded this trip as part of their annual recognition program." She offered a polite but pointed smile, watching the flight attendant's expression carefully. The flight attendant blinked, clearly not expecting resistance. For a brief moment, her carefully rehearsed smile faltered, but she quickly recovered, her face tightening as she glanced back at the boarding pass. "Well, of course, ma'am," she said, her voice a bit more clipped now. "It's just that we want to make sure all of our passengers are as comfortable as possible, and there might be a more suitable option." Rachel cut her off, her patience wearing thin. "I'm perfectly comfortable here, thank you." There was a brief, tense silence between them, and Rachel could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, watching the interaction with thinly veiled curiosity. She knew what they were thinking. She had seen the way they had glanced at her when she first boarded, the way they whispered among themselves as though her very presence was an anomaly. The flight attendant's smile returned, though it was even more strained now. "Very well, ma'am," she said, handing the boarding pass back to Rachel with an almost robotic precision. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." Rachel took the pass and nodded, her smile never wavering. "I'll be sure to let you know." As the flight attendant walked away, Rachel felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. She leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes for a moment and trying to collect herself. She had stood her ground, but the exchange had left a bitter taste in her mouth. It wasn't just about the seat. It was about something deeper, something that ran through every interaction she had faced in her professional life. The constant second-guessing, the subtle and sometimes not so subtle reminders that, to some people, she would never fully belong. Her mind drifted back to the early days of her career, back when she had first started at Nexus Global. The memories were a mix of triumphs and struggles, moments of victory tempered by the constant uphill battle to prove herself. She had worked twice as hard as some of her colleagues, always pushing herself to be better, to do more, because she knew that her margin for error was smaller. As a Black woman in the tech industry, she had to be flawless, or at least as close to flawless as humanly possible. There were days when she had felt the weight of it all, when the doubts and the whispers had worn her down to the point where she had questioned whether it was worth it. The pressure had been relentless. The long hours, the endless meetings where her ideas were overlooked or appropriated by others. The moments when her hard work had been attributed to someone else. And always, there had been the unspoken expectation that she had to prove she deserved her place in the room. But despite it all, Rachel had risen. She had climbed the corporate ladder, step by painstaking step, until she had reached the position of Senior Sales Director, a title she had earned through sheer determination and resilience. She had paid her dues 10 times over, and yet here she was, still facing the same doubts and assumptions. As the plane began to fill with passengers, Rachel opened her eyes, glancing around the cabin once more. She noticed the same furtive glances from the other first-class travelers, their eyes quickly darting away when she met their gaze. It was as if they couldn't quite reconcile the image of her, a successful black woman in her 40s, traveling first class, with their preconceived notions of what someone in her position should look like. She took a deep breath, willing herself to stay calm. She was used to this, used to being the anomaly, the one who didn't quite fit, but that didn't make it any easier to bear. She had spent her whole career fighting for a seat at the table, and even when she had finally earned it, people still questioned whether she truly belonged. Rachel glanced out of the window, the view of the tarmac below offering little solace. The memory of her last major corporate event came flooding back, the annual Nexus Global Gala, where she had been honored for her exceptional performance. It had been a glittering affair, full of top executives and industry leaders, all dressed in their finest. She had been excited, proud even, to attend as one of the company's top earners. But as she had mingled with the crowd, she had quickly realized that, even in that space, there were those who saw her success as a fluke, or worse, as something that had been handed to her out of pity. Her former boss, Richard, an older white man who had always underestimated her, had approached her at the gala, his smile too wide, his congratulations too insincere. "You've done well for yourself," he had said, his voice carrying that same condescending tone he had used when they'd worked together. "I have to admit, I wasn't sure you'd be able to handle the pressure, but it seems you've proven me wrong." Rachel had smiled politely, but inside her blood had boiled. Richard had never believed in her, not even from the beginning. He had constantly undermined her work, often taking credit for her ideas in meetings and dismissing her contributions as insignificant. And now here he was, acting as though her success had somehow surprised him. "I've always handled the pressure just fine," Rachel had replied, her voice cool but firm. "I'm used to it." Richard had laughed, a hollow sound that grated on her nerves. "Well, you've certainly exceeded expectations," he had said, before moving on to schmooze with someone else, leaving Rachel standing there with her drink in hand, the weight of his words settling over her like a cloud. That moment had stuck with her, like so many others. The constant second-guessing, the subtle dismissals, the way her achievements were always framed as surprising or unexpected, as if she had somehow defied the odds by being competent and successful. And now, sitting here in first class, she could feel the same currents of doubt swirling around her. The flight attendant's request, the passenger's whispers, the lingering stares. It was all part of the same narrative. It didn't matter how far she had come or what she had achieved. To some people, she would always be an anomaly, someone who didn't quite fit into their neatly defined boxes of success and privilege. Rachel took a deep breath, trying to shake off the memories, trying to focus on the present. She had earned this seat. She had worked for it, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that away from her. As the final passengers boarded and the flight attendants prepared for takeoff, Rachel adjusted her seatbelt, staring out the window at the airport lights. The world outside seemed so vast, so full of possibilities. And yet here she was, still battling the same prejudices, the same doubts that she had faced for most of her career. But there was one thing Rachel knew for sure. She wasn't going to let this moment define her. She wasn't going to let the small-mindedness of others diminish the significance of her success. She had earned her place in first class, and no one could take that away from her. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, Rachel closed her eyes, her hands resting in her lap. This was her journey, her victory, and no matter how many people questioned it, she knew the truth. The hum of the engines vibrated through the cabin as the plane accelerated down the runway, lifting into the air with a smooth ascent. Rachel's fingers rested lightly on the armrests, her body sinking into the plush leather of her first-class seat. She focused on the sensation of the plane taking flight, on the gentle tug of gravity as they climbed higher, her eyes closing for a moment in a forced attempt to relax. But even as she sat there, the tension from earlier wouldn't release its grip on her. The flight attendant's polite attempt to move her, the stares from the other passengers, and the memories of past flights, all of it swirled together, gnawing at her peace of mind. It was the same script over and over. Every time she entered a space where people didn't expect her to be, whether it was a corporate boardroom, a five-star hotel, or this first-class cabin, The world seemed to question her right to exist in it. She had learned to anticipate it, to brace herself, but it didn't make it any easier. Rachel opened her eyes, her gaze drifting to the window again. The soft glow of city lights below was slowly giving way to the dark expanse of night. Paris awaited her, a trip she had dreamed of for years, now within reach. This should have been a moment of celebrating a victory lap after all the hard work, the sacrifices, the long nights spent proving herself in an industry that often dismissed women who looked like her. But instead of basking in the triumph of the moment, Rachel felt unsettled. Her eyes moved across the cabin, landing on the other passengers. The older couple she had noticed earlier, the woman with her perfectly coiffed white hair and the man with his neatly pressed blazer, were still glancing in her direction. They had stopped whispering, but their expressions were tight, as though something about Rachel's presence made them uncomfortable. The businessman seated ahead of her, the one in the crisp suit who had stolen glances at her since she boarded, was now leaning back in his seat, his tablet in hand. But every so often his head turned ever so slightly, and she could feel his eyes landing on her. It wasn't curiosity, it was disbelief. It didn't matter that Rachel was dressed impeccably in her tailored black slacks and silk blouse, or that she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had worked her way to the top. To them, she was an anomaly, an outlier in a space they considered their own. Rachel's thoughts drifted to the last major conference she had attended, representing Nexus Global. It had been a prestigious tech summit held in San Francisco with leaders from across the globe. She had been one of the featured speakers, chosen to present on the latest innovations in sales strategies and market expansion, a topic she had become an expert in over her decade-long career. But from the moment she had walked into the sleek, glass-walled conference center, Rachel had felt the same undercurrent of doubt. The room had been filled with executives, mostly white, mostly men, and though many had congratulated her for being there, their smiles didn't reach their eyes. It was the same old routine, the handshake that lingered a beat too long, the look that suggested they were trying to place her in the hierarchy of importance. And then there had been the panel discussion. Richard, her former boss, had been a part of the panel as well, along with other prominent figures in the industry. Rachel had been given the prime slot to discuss her success in leading Nexus Global's sales team to record-breaking numbers that year. She had been prepared, confident in her material, ready to shine. But halfway through the discussion, Richard interrupted her. She had been outlining a key strategy her team had developed, one that had directly contributed to their success, when Richard had leaned forward in his chair, cutting her off mid-sentence. "That's an interesting take," he had said, his voice dripping with condescension. "But I think what really drove those numbers was the groundwork my team laid during my tenure there." Rachel had been stunned. For a moment, she had simply stared at him, her mind racing to process what he had just said. He was taking credit for her work. In front of an audience of industry leaders, Richard was framing her success as an extension of his own, as though she had simply built on what he had left behind. She had wanted to call him out on it, to set the record straight. But as the other panelists nodded along with Richard's words, Rachel had felt that familiar weight pressing down on her. The pressure to stay composed, to not let her anger show, to play the part of the gracious, team player woman of color who couldn't afford to rock the boat. Instead, she forced a smile, biting back the words she really wanted to say. "Well," she had replied, her voice steady, "we all know it's a team effort, but I'm proud of the direction we took after I stepped into the leadership role." It had been a subtle pushback, one that few in the audience likely noticed, but inside Rachel had been seething, and as she sat on that stage watching Richard bask in the acknowledgement that should have been hers, she had made a promise to herself. She would never let anyone diminish her work again. Now sitting in her first-class seat on a flight to Paris, Rachel felt the echoes of that promise. The old couple, the businessman, the flight attendant, none of them had said anything outright, but their assumptions, their quiet judgments were just as loud as Richard's interruption had been. Rachel picked up the in-flight menu, trying to distract herself, but the words blurred on the page. Her thoughts kept drifting back to her career, to the moments that had shaped her into the woman she was today. The obstacles, the small victories, the constant battle to assert her worth in spaces where people didn't expect her to be. There had been other mentors along the way too. People like Maya, a senior executive at a rival tech firm who had taken Rachel under her wing early in her career. Maya had been one of the few Black women in a high-ranking position in the industry, and she had taught Rachel how to navigate the minefield of corporate politics with both grace and fire. "Don't let them make you feel like you're lucky to be there," Maya had once told her over coffee. "You earned it, every step of the way, and don't you ever let anyone take that from you." Maya's words had stuck with her, guiding her through the tough moments when Rachel felt like she was the only one fighting to hold her place. It was Maya who had reminded her that success wasn't just about making it to the top. It was about claiming her space unapologetically. But sitting here now, surrounded by the quiet judgments of strangers, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling of being an outsider. The flight attendant returned, moving down the aisle with practical efficiency as she handed out glasses of champagne to the first-class passengers. When she reached Rachel's seat, her smile was a little tighter, her eyes darting away as she placed the glass on Rachel's tray. Rachel nodded in acknowledgement, but her appetite for luxury had soured. As the hours passed, Rachel tried to settle into the long flight, forcing herself to relax. She flipped through a magazine, scrolled through her phone, even tried watching a movie, but none of it could fully distract her from the tension gnawing at the edges of her mind. Each time she glanced up, she caught the same lingering looks from the other passengers. Their glances weren't hostile, more like a puzzle they couldn't quite figure out, and that was what stung the most. She wasn't a person to them. She was a curiosity, an oddity, someone who didn't fit the mold of who they thought belonged in first class. Eventually, exhaustion began to take over, and Rachel reclined her seat slightly, closing her eyes. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane flew over the Atlantic, the quiet hum of the engines lulling some of the passengers into sleep. But Rachel couldn't sleep. Her mind was too full, too restless, replaying the events of the day and all the small, subtle ways her presence had been questioned. She thought about the flight attendant, about the way the woman had hesitated before asking her to move to economy, as if she had been trying to avoid a confrontation but still couldn't shake the assumption that Rachel didn't belong. It was always so subtle, the condescension, the doubt, the assumptions people made without even realizing it. And that was what made it so insidious. It wasn't always the big moments of overt racism or sexism that hurt the most. It was the constant, low-grade hum of doubt that followed her wherever she went, the unspoken question of whether she had really earned her success or if she had just gotten lucky. Rachel opened her eyes again, staring at the darkened cabin around her. She had always believed that if she worked hard enough, if she achieved enough, if she proved herself enough, the doubts would disappear. But here she was, sitting in first class on a flight to Paris with a senior director title at one of the most successful tech companies in the world. And still, the doubts lingered not just from others, but from somewhere deep inside her too. She had spent her whole life fighting for a seat at the table, and now that she had it, the fight wasn't over. It never really ended. As the plane soared through the night, Rachel made a decision. She wasn't going to spend this trip, the trip she had earned, feeling like she didn't belong. She wasn't going to let the stares, the whispers, or the subtle judgments steal her joy. This was her moment, and she was going to own it, just like she had owned every other victory in her life. Rachel sat up straighter in her seat, her hands resting on the armrests. She wasn't here by accident. She wasn't a fluke. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, and she wasn't going to let anyone, not the passengers, not the flight attendants, not the voices of doubt in her own mind, tell her otherwise. Rachel sat up straighter, determination coursing through her as the plane moved steadily through the night sky. She'd spent the first few hours of this flight feeling the weight of doubt, of judgment, of subtle and overt questioning, and it was wearing on her. But now something inside her had shifted. This was her time. She wasn't about to let anyone take it from her. The flight attendant returned, moving quietly down the aisle, offering passengers extra blankets and checking on their needs. Rachel watched her approach, a sense of calm determination settling over her. She could see the tension in the flight attendant's posture as she neared Rachel's seat, the way her smile tightened slightly when their eyes met. Ma'am, the flight attendant said again, that same rehearsed politeness in her voice. I'm terribly sorry to bother you again, but we're still experiencing some issues with seating arrangements. I was just thinking, to avoid any further inconvenience, you might be more comfortable in one of the available seats in the back, in economy. There it was, the suggestion thinly veiled as a polite offer. Rachel could feel the eyes of the other passengers turning toward her once again. They were watching, waiting to see how she would react, probably thinking the same thing the flight attendant was. What is she doing here? Rachel had heard this before, in 100 different ways, in 100 different rooms. But tonight she wasn't going to shrink back, wasn't going to let this be another moment where she let someone's quiet assumptions go unchecked. She had earned her place in this seat. Rachel didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. Her voice was steady as she replied, "There's no need for me to move. I'm perfectly comfortable where I am, thank you." The flight attendant's smile didn't falter, but there was something flickering in her eyes now, a hint of surprise, maybe even frustration, as though she hadn't expected Rachel to stand her ground so firmly. "Well, ma'am," the flight attendant said, her tone still pleasant, but now edged with a hint of something sharper. "It's just that there's been a mix-up, and I want to make sure all of our passengers are accommodated properly. We wouldn't want there to be any confusion." Rachel leaned back slightly in her seat, her fingers resting on the armrests as she met the woman's gaze head-on. "There's no confusion," Rachel said, her voice calm but firm. "This is my seat. I was awarded this trip as part of my company's annual recognition program for top performance. There's no mix-up." For a brief moment, the flight attendant's composure cracked. Her eyes darted to the boarding pass in Rachel's lap, and Rachel could see the uncertainty flickering there. The flight attendant blinked, her smile wavering, and then she straightened as if bracing herself. "Well, I'll need to double-check that," she said, her voice a little less smooth now. Rachel could feel her heartbeat quicken, her frustration growing. She had already shown her boarding pass. She had already explained herself. How many times would she have to justify her presence in this seat? She had thought about letting it go, about letting the woman walk away and deal with her own misplaced assumptions. But then Rachel remembered something, a detail she hadn't considered at first, but now felt crucial. She reached into her satchel, her fingers finding the small, worn envelope that she always carried with her. Inside was something she hadn't planned on pulling out tonight, something she had kept with her more as a memento than anything else. But now it feels like exactly the right time. Rachel slid the envelope open and pulled out the photograph inside. She could feel the eyes of the passengers on her, feel the weight of the moment as the flight attendant watched, clearly not expecting what was about to come next. Rachel looked up, locking eyes with the flight attendant, and then handed her the photograph. "Here," Rachel said quietly, her voice calm but edged with a kind of steel that demanded attention. "Maybe this will clear up any confusion." The flight attendant hesitated, clearly taken aback by the gesture. Her brow furrowed slightly as she took the photo from Rachel's hand, glancing down at it. For a long, heavy moment, there was silence. In the photograph, Rachel stood proudly next to David Monroe, the CEO of Nexus Global Technologies. They were at the company's annual gala, both smiling broadly, a large banner behind them reading, "Congratulations to our top sales manager of the year." Beneath that, in bold letters, was the award. First-class trip to Paris. The flight attendant's face drained of color as the image registered. Her carefully maintained composure crumbled. The smile vanished, replaced by a look of shock, then horror, as the reality of her mistake sank in. Her eyes widened as she glanced back up at Rachel, then down at the photo again, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. I didn't realize," the flight attendant stammered, her voice faltering, the confidence she'd carried just moments ago evaporating. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. I didn't know." Rachel's expression didn't change. She held her ground, her voice steady but thick with disappointment as she replied, "You didn't know because you assumed." The flight attendant's face flushed a deep red, her hands trembling slightly as she handed the photograph back to Rachel. I apologize," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to." Rachel held up a hand, cutting her off mid-sentence. There was no need for the apology to go any further. The damage had already been done. It wasn't about the words themselves. It was about the assumptions that had led to this moment. The assumptions that Rachel didn't belong, that she couldn't possibly be someone who deserved to sit in first class. "I'm tired of being assumed about," Rachel said softly, her voice tinged with a quiet power that silenced the entire cabin. The flight attendant bowed her head, mumbling a string of apologies as she quickly backed away, retreating to the front of the plane. Around Rachel, the other passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The tension that had filled the cabin earlier was now replaced with an uneasy silence, the weight of embarrassment and guilt hanging thick in the air. Rachel exhaled slowly, her muscles unwinding as the flight attendant disappeared from view. She could feel the eyes of the passengers on her still, but now they weren't filled with judgment or disbelief. Now there was something else, something like guilt, or maybe even shame. The older couple who had been whispering about her earlier were now staring straight ahead, their faces tight with discomfort. The businessman in the row ahead, who had been so quick to glance over at her, was now studiously avoiding her gaze, his posture stiff. And the rest of the passengers, who had been silently questioning her presence, seemed to have lost their appetite for judgment. The silence in the cabin was thick, palpable. No one said a word. No one dared. Rachel allowed herself a small, private smile, her hands resting in her lap as she settled back into her seat. She hadn't sought confrontation, hadn't wanted to make a scene, but this had been different. This wasn't just about a seat on a plane. It was about standing her ground, about claiming the space she had earned and deserved. And for once, she hadn't let the world tell her otherwise. As the plane continued its journey across the Atlantic, the quiet around her shifted. What had once been a space filled with doubt and judgment was now filled with something else. It wasn't peace exactly, but it was close enough. Rachel gazed out of the window, watching the endless dark sky as they flew toward Paris. The lights of the airport had long since disappeared, replaced by the inky blackness of the ocean far below. She felt lighter now, her shoulders less burdened, the weight of the day slowly lifting. The whispers that had followed her since she boarded had faded, replaced by a newfound quiet. No one was questioning her now. No one was staring. No one was whispering. No one was doubting her right to be there. For the first time since she had arrived at the airport, Rachel felt like she could truly breathe. She leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes, letting the tension slip away. This moment was hers, and she was going to savor it. The soft hum of the engines blended into the background as Rachel finally allowed herself to relax. She wasn't naive. She knew this wasn't the end of the challenges she'd face, the assumptions that would be made, or the battles she'd still have to fight. But right now, in this moment, she had won. She had asserted her worth, reminded herself and everyone around her that she belonged. And that was a victory worth celebrating. The seat was more than just leather and extra legroom. It represented every late night, every overlooked idea, every time she had been underestimated. This seat, this first-class ticket, was her hard-earned reward, a reflection of her resilience, her strength, and her undeniable success. No one could take that away from her now. The plane drifted steadily across the ocean, the rhythmic drone of the engines becoming a soothing backdrop to Rachel's thoughts. As she sat there staring out into the dark expanse of sky and sea below, she couldn't help but reflect on her journey, the long, winding path that had led her to this moment. Her mind drifted back to her early days, fresh out of college, eager and full of ambition. Back then, she had believed in the idea of meritocracy, the belief that hard work and dedication would be enough to rise to the top. But it hadn't taken long for reality to set in. Rachel had entered the tech industry full of promise, one of only a handful of Black women in her company. At first, she had been overlooked for projects, her contributions either ignored or dismissed. The subtle way she had been shut out had been devastating. She remembered her first major meeting, where she'd come prepared with data, ideas, and insights that could have made a difference, only to be talked over by her male colleagues. At that time, her boss, Richard, had brushed off her frustration, saying, "You'll get your chance, Rachel. You just need to be patient." But patience had become a code word for being sidelined. While her white male peers were being fast-tracked, she was told to wait, to be patient, as if the path to success wasn't available to her. Rachel's determination had only grown in response. She had worked twice as hard, taking on projects no one else wanted, staying late to perfect her reports, volunteering for presentations that everyone else avoided. She had built a reputation for being the most prepared, the most meticulous. But even then, there had been doubters. There was that one meeting with Richard and other top executives when she had finally been given the floor to present a crucial project she had spearheaded, a deal that had the potential to secure millions in revenue for the company. She remembered feeling nervous but ready. This was her moment. But halfway through her presentation, Richard had interrupted her. "Let me take it from here," he had said with a smile, stepping in and taking over the presentation she had spent weeks preparing. He took the credit, never once acknowledging the countless hours Rachel had poured into the project. And when the deal was signed, it was Richard who received praise, while Rachel was left to sit on the sidelines once again. That had been a turning point for Rachel. She realized that it didn't matter how hard she worked or how much she achieved. People like Richard would always find a way to take the credit. From that moment on, she decided she wasn't going to let anyone diminish her accomplishments. She would take control of her narrative, make sure her voice was heard, and claim her place at the table. Her thoughts drifted back to Maya, her mentor and friend. Maya had been a guiding light during those difficult early years, a reminder that Rachel wasn't alone in her struggles. Maya had already been in the industry long enough to know the ropes, and she had taught Rachel the most valuable lesson. Success was about more than just hard work. It was about navigating the politics, standing up for yourself, and most importantly, never letting anyone make you feel like you didn't belong. Rachel remembered one of their conversations over coffee. Maya had been her usual fierce, no-nonsense self. "Rachel," she had said, leaning forward with that fiery gleam in her eye, "you've got to stop waiting for permission. No one's going to give you the power you deserve. You have to take it." It was advice Rachel had carried with her for years. Whenever the doubts crept in, whenever someone tried to make her feel small or out of place, she remembered Maya's words, "Take it. Don't wait for anyone to give it to you." That's exactly what she had done tonight. On this flight, Rachel had stood her ground, made it clear she wasn't going to shrink into the background, wasn't going to move to the back just because someone else was uncomfortable. She had taken her power, claimed the seat she had earned. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, and Rachel was jolted back to the present. The cabin lights had dimmed, and most of the passengers were either sleeping or quietly watching movies on their screens. The businessman in front of her had finally settled down, and the older couple across the aisle had drifted off to sleep, their heads leaning toward one another. Rachel closed her eyes again, thinking about the future. She knew that when she arrived in Paris, she wouldn't just be stepping into a city she had dreamed of visiting. She would be stepping into a new phase of her life, a phase where she no longer felt the need to apologize for her success, no longer felt the need to justify her place in the world. She had spent too much of her career shrinking herself, trying to make herself smaller to fit into spaces that weren't designed for her. But she was done with that now. She was done waiting for approval, done seeking validation from people who would never truly see her for who she was. Rachel wasn't just going to visit Paris. She was going to revel in it. She was going to walk those streets with her head held high, take in the art, the history, the beauty of the city, and allow herself to feel every bit of joy and pride she deserved. She wasn't just flying first class. She was soaring. 2 days later, in Paris, Rachel found herself standing at the top of the Eiffel Tower, gazing out over the sprawling city below. The wind was cool, crisp against her skin, and the sky stretched out in a perfect shade of blue. She had spent the last 2 days immersing herself in the city's culture, visiting the Louvre, strolling through the streets of Montmartre, and eating her way through every bakery she could find. But now, standing here at the top of the tower, she felt a deep sense of accomplishment, not just because she had finally made it to Paris, but because of everything it represented. This trip wasn't just a reward for her hard work. It was a celebration of the person she had become, the journey she had taken to get here. As she looked out over the city, her phone buzzed in her pocket. Rachel pulled it out and saw a message from David Monroe, her CEO. It was simple but heartfelt. "Rachel, I saw the photo you shared from the top of the Eiffel Tower. I just wanted to say, We couldn't be more proud of you. You've always been a leader, and this trip is just one of many more rewards to come. Enjoy Paris. You've more than earned it." Rachel smiled, pocketing the phone. She didn't need David's praise to validate her accomplishments, but it felt good to know that the people who mattered recognized her worth. As she stood there, soaking in the breathtaking view of Paris, Rachel felt something settle inside her. It was the kind of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. The kind of peace that came from knowing, without a doubt, that she belonged. Not just in this city, not just in her company, but everywhere. In any space she walked into, in any room she claimed. Rachel had worked for this. She had earned it. And she wasn't going to let anyone, not ever again, make her feel like she didn't deserve to be exactly where she was. As the wind swept through her hair, Rachel closed her eyes and smiled. She wasn't just flying first class anymore. She was soaring. The Eiffel Tower stood tall behind her, casting its shadow across the bustling Parisian streets. Rachel lingered at the railing, looking out over the city. She had spent hours here, soaking in every detail, allowing the beauty of the moment to fill her with a sense of peace and pride. But now as she descended from the tower and rejoined the flow of tourists below, the memory of the flight crept back into her thoughts. It hadn't left her mind since that night. The stares, the assumptions, the quiet, insidious doubt she had felt from the passengers and crew alike. Even though she had stood her ground and claimed her space, the weight of it lingered, gnawing at the edges of her thoughts. It was an experience she had had many times before, but this time felt different. This time, she was done being silent. She walked slowly through the narrow streets, her thoughts swirling. Paris had always been her dream destination, a city that represented art, culture, freedom, and possibility. But now as she wandered through its winding avenues, she realized that this trip was about more than just a vacation. It was about something deeper, something personal. It was about reclaiming her space, about taking control of her narrative. Rachel had spent her whole career trying to prove that she belonged in rooms where people didn't expect to see her. And while she had achieved so much, there was still that lingering question: would she ever truly be seen for who she was? As she passed by a small cafe, the smell of freshly baked croissants filled the air. She glanced at the outdoor tables, seeing locals and tourists alike enjoying the sunny afternoon. Rachel paused, feeling the urge to sit, to reflect, to put her thoughts in order. She entered the cafe and found a small table by the window, ordering a coffee and a pastry, her mind still swirling with the events of the past few days. Her phone buzzed again, and she saw a message from one of her closest friends back in the US. "Tara, how's Paris treating you, girl? I saw your photos. Look like you're living it up." Rachel smiled at the message, typing back a quick response. "It's beautiful here. Just take it all in. Can't wait to tell you all about it when I get back." But even as she sent the message, Rachel felt a pull to do more than just share her experience with Tara. She had been thinking about this for days, about the injustice of that flight, about how often women like her were forced to justify their success in ways others didn't have to. The polite condescension, the assumptions that whispered, "You don't belong here." This wasn't just her story, it was the story of so many others too. Rachel sipped her coffee, feeling the warmth spread through her. She opened her laptop and began typing, her fingers flying across the keyboard as her thoughts poured out of her. She wrote about the flight, about the way the flight attendant had asked her to move to economy, about the passengers who had stared at her like she didn't belong. She wrote about her career, about the countless times she had been underestimated, doubted, or sidelined, even after all she had achieved. And she wrote about how tired she was of having to prove herself, of having to fight for space in rooms she had earned a right to be in. But most importantly, she wrote about the decision she had made on that flight, the decision to stop shrinking herself to fit into the narrow boxes other people had built for her. She wrote about standing up, claiming her space, and refusing to let anyone else tell her what she was worth. By the time Rachel finished, her heart was racing. She hadn't intended to write so much, but the words had flowed out of her in a way she hadn't expected. She looked at the screen, her hands trembling slightly as she read over the final lines. "We are not anomalies. We are not outliers. We are here, and we belong. And it's time the world adjusts to that." Rachel sat back, exhaling slowly. This was more than just a blog post. It was a declaration, a message to herself and to anyone else who had ever felt like they didn't belong. For too long, she had been quiet about these experiences, had internalized the doubt and allowed it to chip away at her self-worth. But now she was done being silent. She pressed publish and closed her laptop, her heart still pounding. She didn't know how people would respond, if anyone would even read it. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that she had finally spoken her truth. She had taken the first step toward changing the narrative, not just for herself, but for all the other women who had faced the same struggles. As the hours passed, Rachel wandered the streets of Paris, her mind buzzing with both excitement and nervousness. She had put herself out there in a way she never had before, and it felt both empowering and terrifying. What would people think? Would they understand? Would they care? It wasn't until the next morning, as she sat at breakfast in her hotel room, that Rachel realized her blog post had struck a nerve. Her phone buzzed nonstop, messages, emails, notifications from social media. Curious, she opened her laptop and saw that the post had gone viral. Thousands of women had shared it, commenting on their own experiences of being questioned, dismissed, and overlooked. Women from all walks of life, corporate executives, entrepreneurs, young professionals, had responded, each one echoing the same sentiment. I've been there too. Rachel's inbox was flooded with messages, not just from women in her industry, but from people all over the world who had read her post and found themselves in her words. Some were full of gratitude, thanking her for sharing a story that felt all too familiar. Others were angry at the systems and structures that had made it so difficult for women like Rachel to succeed without constantly being questioned. Her phone rang, and when she answered, it was her boss, David Monroe, on the other end. "Rachel," he said, his voice full of warmth, "I saw your post. I just wanted to tell you how proud I am of you. Not just for what you've accomplished, but for speaking up." Rachel smiled, though her heart still raced with uncertainty. "I wasn't sure how people would take it," she admitted. "I just felt like I had to say something." "You did more than say something," David replied. "You started a conversation, and it's a conversation that needed to happen." They spoke for a while, discussing the impact her post had already had and what it meant for the company moving forward. David expressed his support, not just personally but professionally, assuring Rachel that Nexus Global would be behind her every step of the way. After they hung up, Rachel sat in stunned silence for a moment. She hadn't expected this flood of support, this outpouring of stories from women all over the world who had felt what she had felt. It was overwhelming, but in the best possible way. Rachel knew this was only the beginning. She had opened a door that couldn't be closed, and she was ready to walk through it. A week later, Rachel found herself sitting in the audience at a major tech conference in Paris. She hadn't planned to attend initially. This was supposed to be her vacation after all. But after her post went viral, she had been invited to speak on a panel about women in leadership. The invitation had come from the event organizers themselves, who had read her story and wanted her voice to be part of the conversation. As she sat there, waiting for her turn to speak, Rachel felt a sense of calm wash over her. She had spent so many years trying to prove that she belonged, but now she was stepping into her power, fully and unapologetically. When it was her turn, Rachel stood up, walking to the front of the stage with confidence. She glanced out at the audience, an audience full of executives, innovators, and industry leaders. And for the first time in her career, she didn't feel out of place. She belonged here. She always had. Rachel began her speech telling the story of her journey, the struggles, the triumphs, the moments of doubt, and the moments of victory. She spoke about the importance of women claiming their space, about the need for companies and industries to recognize and value the contributions of women of color. And most importantly, she spoke about how the world needed to stop questioning women like her and start listening to them instead. The room was silent as she spoke, the weight of her words hanging in the air. And when she finished, the applause was thunderous. Rachel stepped off the stage, feeling lighter than she had in years. She had spent so long waiting for the world to recognize her worth, but now she realized that the only recognition she had ever needed was her own. As she walked through the crowd, shaking hands and meeting people who had been moved by her words, Rachel knew that this was just the beginning. There was so much more work to do, but she was ready for it, ready to take up the space she had fought so hard to claim. Rachel stood at the edge of the stage, her heart still pounding from the applause that had erupted as she finished her speech. The spotlight was bright, but it wasn't the kind of spotlight she had feared earlier in her career, the one that came with judgment, with whispers of doubt. This was a spotlight that illuminated her fully, that showed the world exactly who she was and what she had accomplished. And this time, she wasn't going to shrink away from it. The conference in Paris had been more than just an opportunity. It had been a turning point. The viral success of her blog post had propelled her into the public eye in a way she hadn't anticipated. And now, standing on stage in front of the most powerful figures in the tech industry, she could feel the weight of what this moment meant, not just for her, but for all the women who had been silenced or ignored. She descended the stage and was immediately surrounded by people, executives, industry leaders, fellow speakers, all eager to speak with her, to congratulate her. They weren't just patting her on the back, they were genuinely listening. For the first time, Rachel felt truly heard. As she shook hands and exchanged business cards, she noticed a familiar face in the crowd. Tara, her close friend, who had flown out to Paris to support her after hearing about the conference. Tara beamed as she approached, pulling Rachel into a tight hug. "Girl, you were amazing up there," Tara said, her eyes shining with pride. "I've never seen anything like it." Rachel smiled, feeling a surge of gratitude. "Thank you. I can't believe all of this is happening. It's, overwhelming, but in a good way." "You're not just opening doors," Tara said, stepping back to look her in the eye. "You're breaking them down." Rachel laughed softly, but she knew Tara was right. This wasn't just about her anymore. Her blog post had ignited something, a conversation that had been long overdue. Women from all corners of the industry had started reaching out, sharing their stories, their frustrations, their victories. Rachel had become a voice for something much larger than herself. And with that realization came a responsibility she hadn't anticipated. A few weeks later, back in New York, Rachel sat in a sleek conference room at Nexus Global Technologies, surrounded by the senior leadership team. It was a board meeting, but this time, things were different. Rachel wasn't just there as a participant, she had been invited to lead a new initiative within the company. David Monroe had personally asked her to take charge of a task force focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion, not just within Nexus Global, but in partnership with other leading tech companies. This was her chance to affect real, lasting change, and she wasn't going to waste it. David sat at the head of the table, his eyes on Rachel as he introduced her to the rest of the board. "Rachel has been with us for over a decade," he began, his voice steady and full of respect. "And I think we can all agree that her contributions have been invaluable to our success. But beyond her work in sales, Rachel has shown us what it means to lead with integrity, resilience, and vision." The other executives nodded, their expressions a mix of admiration and anticipation. Rachel could feel their eyes on her, but this time, the attention didn't feel suffocating. It felt empowering. David continued, "In light of the conversations happening across our industry, conversations that Rachel herself has helped to start, I'm proud to announce that she will be leading our new initiative on diversity, equity, and inclusion. This task force will work with other companies, educational institutions, and community leaders to create a more inclusive future for tech, and I can't think of anyone better suited to lead this effort." Rachel's heart swelled with pride, but it wasn't just about the title or the recognition. It was about the opportunity to make real change, to reshape an industry that had so often excluded people like her. She stood taking a deep breath as she addressed the room. "Thank you, David," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'm honored to take on this role, but I want to make one thing clear. This isn't just about Nexus Global. This is about the entire tech industry. We've seen too many talented people, especially women and people of color, pushed to the sidelines or overlooked entirely. That needs to change, and it needs to change now." She paused, scanning the faces of the executives around the table. They were listening, really listening. "This task force isn't going to be about checking boxes or meeting quotas," Rachel continued. "It's going to be about fundamentally rethinking how we operate as an industry. how we recruit, how we promote, how we foster an environment where everyone, no matter their background, feels like they belong. Because the truth is, diversity isn't just a nice to have. It's essential for innovation, for creativity, for success. As she spoke, she could see the nods of agreement from around the room. This was the moment she had been working toward her entire career. Not just a seat at the table, but the ability to influence the direction of the company and, by extension, the industry. "And I want to make one more thing clear," Rachel said, her voice growing stronger. "This isn't just my fight. This is our fight. Every one of us in this room has a responsibility to push for change, to challenge the status quo, and to create an industry that reflects the world we live in. And I know that together we can make that happen." The room erupted in applause. Not the polite kind, but the kind that came from genuine agreement, from people who were ready to follow her lead. Rachel sat down, her heart still racing, but filled with a sense of purpose she had never felt before. Over the next few months, Rachel threw herself into her new role, working tirelessly to build the foundations of diversity and inclusion initiative. She held meetings with executives from other tech companies, organized panels with leaders in education and social justice, and partnered with organizations that focused on empowering women and minorities in STEM fields. The impact was immediate. Within weeks, Nexus Global announced new scholarship programs for underrepresented students, mentorship programs for young professionals, and company-wide initiatives aimed at creating a more inclusive culture. Other companies followed suit, reaching out to Rachel for advice on how to replicate Nexus Global's approach. Rachel had always believed in the power of hard work, in the importance of resilience, but now she was seeing firsthand the power of leadership. Real leadership, the kind that didn't just open doors but tore them down for others to walk through. One afternoon, Rachel received an email from Maya, her old mentor and friend. It was brief, but it meant the world to Rachel. "Rachel, I've been watching you from afar, and I just wanted to say how proud I am. You're doing exactly what I always knew you were capable of. You're not just leading, you're changing the game. Keep going. The world needs you." Rachel smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. Maya had been there for her in those early, difficult days when Rachel had doubted whether she could ever truly succeed in an industry that seemed designed to keep her out. Now she was here, leading the charge for change, not just for herself, but for all the women who would come after her. As the months passed, Rachel's influence only grew. She became a sought-after speaker at conferences and events, sharing her story and her vision for a more inclusive tech industry. Her voice reached far beyond the walls of Nexus Global, inspiring women across the globe to step into their power, to demand their place at the table. One evening, as she prepared for yet another panel discussion, Rachel sat quietly in her office, reflecting on how far she had come. The weight of her journey settled over her, the struggles, the triumphs, the moments of doubt, and the moments of victory. She thought back to that flight to Paris, the way the flight attendant had questioned her, the way the passengers had stared at her as though she didn't belong. And she realized that, in a way, those moments had brought her here. They had ignited a fire in her, a determination to claim her space in the world, to make sure no one ever felt the way she had that day. Rachel smiled to herself, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. She wasn't just fighting for her own success anymore. She was fighting for something bigger, something more important. She wasn't just flying first class, she was leading the way. The New York skyline stretched out before Rachel as she stood by her office window, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The view never failed to impress her, but tonight, as the city lights flickered one by one, she found herself thinking about how far she had come. The bustling streets below mirrored her own busy schedule, but there was a calm inside her now, a deep sense of peace that she hadn't always known. It had been nearly a year since she had stepped into her role as head of Nexus Global's Diversity and Inclusion Task Force, and the transformation within the company had been profound. People were talking, really talking, about the changes that had been implemented. The once rigid corporate structures were evolving, creating more space for voices that had long been silenced. Rachel smiled to herself, thinking about the mentorship programs she had helped establish, the scholarship initiatives that were already seeing success, and the new wave of talent entering the tech industry. The ripple effect of her work was reaching far beyond the walls of Nexus Global. Other companies had followed suit, and the industry as a whole was starting to shift in ways Rachel had once only dreamed about. Her phone buzzed on the desk behind her, breaking her thoughts. She turned away from the window and picked it up, seeing a message from David Monroe. Rachel, just reviewed the new partnership proposals for the task force. Incredible work. You're building something that will last far beyond our time here. Proud to have you lead this. Let's catch up soon. Rachel smiled as she read the message, feeling a warmth spread through her. David had been a strong ally throughout the process, supporting her every step of the way, and it felt good to know that her work wasn't just being recognized, it was being valued. But this wasn't about recognition anymore. Rachel had come to realize that true power didn't come from the titles or the accolades. It came from knowing that she was making a difference, that she was helping to create a world where future generations wouldn't have to fight as hard to be seen. She sat down at her desk, her fingers tracing the edges of a small, worn photograph. It was the same photo she had shown the flight attendant on that fateful night, one of her shaking hands with David at the Nexus Global Gala. That moment had marked a significant turning point in her life, but it had also served as a reminder of how much further there was to go. Now she was leading the charge, not just for herself, but for all the women who had come before her and all the women who would follow. 2 weeks later, Rachel found herself standing at the entrance of a conference room in San Francisco, waiting to be introduced. It was the annual Global Women in Tech Summit, and this time, Rachel wasn't just attending, she was delivering the keynote speech. The organizers had reached out to her months ago, asking if she would be willing to share her story and her vision for the future of tech. It was a full circle moment, returning to the city where her journey in tech had truly begun. The memories of past conferences and meetings flashed in her mind. The times when she had been overlooked, silenced, or underestimated. But those moments didn't sting anymore. They had shaped her into the leader she had become. The doors opened and the sound of applause filled the room as Rachel walked to the stage, her heart steady and her mind clear. The audience was made up of women from all corners of the industry. Developers, engineers, CEOs, students, all of them looking at her with a mix of admiration and anticipation. Rachel stood tall, feeling the weight of the moment, but welcoming it. She began to speak, her voice carrying across the room with confidence and grace. "I'm standing here today," she began, "not because of luck or chance, but because of the countless women who came before me. Women who pushed boundaries, broke barriers, and refused to stay silent. And now it's our turn. It's our turn to take up space, to demand our place in this industry, and to make sure that no one ever doubts our right to be here." The room was silent, every eye fixed on Rachel as she continued, sharing her journey, her challenges, and the triumphs that had brought her here. She spoke about the importance of mentorship, of lifting one another up, of building a future where diversity wasn't just a buzzword, but a reality. "This industry was built on innovation," Rachel said, her voice growing stronger. "And the greatest innovations come from diversity. Diversity of thought, of background, of experience. If we want to create a future that truly reflects the world we live in, we need to embrace that diversity fully and without hesitation." The applause that followed was deafening, a standing ovation that seemed to last forever. Rachel stood there letting the moment wash over her, knowing that this wasn't just about her. It was about every woman in that room, every woman who had ever been told she didn't belong, every woman who had ever been doubted. As she left the stage, women approached her, shaking her hand, thanking her for her words, for her leadership, for being the voice they had needed to hear. One young woman, a recent college graduate with wide eyes and an eager smile, pulled Rachel aside. "I just want you to know," she said quietly, "you're the reason I decided to pursue a career in tech. I read your story and it gave me the confidence to believe that I could do it too." Rachel's heart swelled as she hugged the young woman. "You absolutely can," she said, her voice soft but full of certainty. "And don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise." A month later, Rachel found herself back in New York, sitting at her favorite cafe near her apartment, sipping a cappuccino as the late afternoon sun filtered through the windows. Life had been a whirlwind of conferences, meetings, and speaking engagements, but today she had finally found a quiet moment to herself. She opened her laptop planning to catch up on emails, but instead, she found herself scrolling through the hundreds of messages she had received since her blog post had gone viral. So many women had reached out, some seeking advice, others simply wanting to share their stories. It was overwhelming in the best way. She thought about the young women she had met at the summit, about the future leaders and innovators she had the privilege of mentoring, and she thought about Maya, the woman who had mentored her all those years ago, the woman who had once told her that the world needed her voice. Rachel smiled to herself, knowing that she had made good on that promise. She had found her voice, and she had used it not just for herself, but for all the others who needed to hear it. As she sat there, a familiar thought came to her mind, the one that had first crossed her mind on that flight to Paris. She wasn't just flying first class anymore. She was soaring, not because she had been given a seat, but because she had claimed it for herself and for every woman who had ever been told she didn't belong. And as she watched the world pass by outside the cafe window, Rachel knew that the journey was far from over. There was still so much work to be done, but she was ready for it, ready to lead, to inspire, to continue breaking down barriers. Because now Rachel Evans knew exactly who she was, and she wasn't going to let anything or anyone stop her from taking up the space she had earned. She wasn't just a woman in tech. She was a leader, a trailblazer, a force to be reckoned with. And she was just getting started. The air was crisp as Rachel stood on the rooftop terrace of her apartment, watching the sun set over New York City. The sky was a wash of orange and purple, the skyline glowing against the fading light. She took a deep breath, savoring a moment of peace. It had been a whirlwind year, full of challenges, triumphs, and new beginnings. But now in this quiet moment, Rachel allowed herself to reflect on everything that had brought her here. She had started this journey with a simple desire to prove that she belonged. And along the way, she had realized something much more profound. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. Her journey had never been about seeking validation. It had been about claiming her power, her voice, and her place in the world. As she stood there sipping a glass of wine, she thought about how different things felt now. The industry had started to change, little by little, thanks to the efforts of people like her who had refused to be silenced. But more than that, Rachel had changed. She had found a deeper confidence in herself, a sense of belonging that didn't rely on the approval of others. She wasn't just a woman fighting for a seat at the table anymore. She was building the table, creating space for others to sit beside her. Her phone buzzed softly in her pocket. Rachel smiled, pulling it out to see a message from Maya. "I read the article about you in the Times. You're a star, Rachel. I'm so proud of you." Rachel's smile widened. Maya had been one of the first people to believe in her, to push her to take up space in rooms where she had once felt invisible. And now, years later, Rachel was doing the same for others. She typed a quick response. "Thank you, Maya. Couldn't have done it without you. Let's catch up soon." Setting her phone aside, Rachel leaned against the terrace railing, letting the cool breeze brush against her skin. The world felt open now, full of possibility. But this time it wasn't about chasing success or proving her worth. It was about living in her truth, about leading with purpose and authenticity. The events of the past year played out in her mind. The viral blog post, the conferences, the speaking engagements, the diversity initiative at Nexus Global. Each moment had been a step towards something larger, something that would outlast her. She knew that the work she was doing wasn't just about the present. It was about paving the way for the future. Her thoughts wandered back to that flight to Paris, the turning point that had shifted everything. It seemed like a lifetime ago now, but she could still feel the weight of that moment. The way she had been questioned, doubted, and asked to move to the back, as if her place wasn't where she had worked so hard to be. But instead of letting it break her, Rachel had used that moment to fuel her resolve. She had stood her ground then, and she had continued to stand her ground ever since. And now, as she looked out over the city, she knew that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The next morning, Rachel walked through the glass doors of Nexus Global's headquarters, feeling the familiar rush of energy that always came with the start of a new day. The building was bustling with activity, Teams collaborating on projects, meetings in progress, ideas flowing. This was the world she had helped shape, and she felt proud of the part she had played in it. She made her way to the top floor, where her office overlooked the skyline. It was a spacious, modern office, something she would have dreamed of when she first started out in the tech industry. But now it wasn't the office itself that mattered to her. It was the work that happened here, the impact that rippled out from every decision, every initiative, every conversation. As she sat at her desk, her assistant knocked on the door, peeking in with a smile. "Good morning, Rachel. The board meeting is in an hour. Do you need anything before then?" Rachel shook her head, returning the smile. "No, I'm all set. Thanks." Her assistant nodded and left the room, closing the door softly behind her. Rachel leaned back in her chair, thinking about the meeting ahead. Today's agenda included discussions about expanding the Diversity and Inclusion Task Force's reach, not just within the company but globally. Nexus Global had already made huge strides, and now other companies are following their lead. Rachel had seen the change firsthand. More women, more people of color, more diverse voices were stepping into leadership roles, and it was transforming the industry. But there was still more to do. She wasn't under any illusions. The fight wasn't over. Change was slow, and there were always obstacles, always pushback, but Rachel was ready for it. She had spent her entire career preparing for this moment, and now that she was here, she wasn't going to stop. Her phone buzzed again, this time with an email notification. She opened it and saw a message from David Monroe. "Rachel, I just wanted to let you know that the partnership with Tech Women for the Mentoring Initiative has been approved. It's happening. Let's discuss in the meeting later, but I couldn't wait to share the news." Rachel's heart lifted. The Tech Women Initiative had been a passion project of hers, a global mentoring program aimed at connecting young women from underrepresented backgrounds with industry leaders. It was designed to give them the support and resources they needed to succeed in tech, to show them that they had a place in the industry. She had fought hard for this, and now it was becoming a reality. Rachel stood, walking over to the window and looking out at the city below. She thought about all the women she had mentored, all the women she had met at conferences, all the messages she had received from women around the world who had been inspired by her story. They weren't anomalies. They weren't outliers. They belonged, and Rachel had made it her mission to ensure that they knew it. As she gazed out at the skyline, Rachel felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was what victory looked like. Not in the flashy, headline-grabbing way she had once imagined, but in the quiet, steady way that truly mattered. It wasn't about the applause or the recognition. It was about the change she had helped create, the doors she had opened, the space she had made for others to step into. This was her quiet victory. That evening, Rachel returned to her apartment, the city lights twinkling outside her window. She made herself a cup of tea and settled onto the couch, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. The day had been full, but in the best way. She had spoken up in the board meeting, had led discussions on initiatives that would change lives, and had felt the ripple effects of her work spreading out across the industry. But now in the stillness of her apartment, she allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. She had come so far from the days when she had been overlooked, doubted, and sidelined. She had fought through noise, the assumptions, the stereotypes, and had emerged stronger, more confident, and more determined than ever. But what made her proudest wasn't her own success. It was the knowledge that she had helped others find their voice, their place, their power. Rachel took a sip of her tea, letting the warmth settle in her chest. The fight wasn't over, but she was ready for whatever came next. She wasn't afraid anymore, and she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she had the strength and the support to face them head on. Because now more than ever, Rachel Evans knew that she belonged. She wasn't just flying first class anymore. She was leading a revolution. As Rachel sat back, letting the warmth of the moment settle in, she smiled. Her journey wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever felt like they didn't belong, who had fought for their place in the world and emerged stronger. If Rachel's story has inspired you, if you've ever felt like you were fighting to claim your space, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Join us for more stories of resilience, empowerment, and transformation. Your story matters too, and together we can make sure it's heard.